Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Big Idea Podcast. My name is Eric Bramlett. I am joined by Brian Moll. Brian, how you doing today?
So good.
So good, man. Every time I ask you, I feel like you're stealing my line, but
I'll come up with a better one. Never been better. I've never been better than I am right now.
Now, I mean, you can kind of objectively, like, I believe that you're doing so good. It's harder for me to believe that you've never been better.
Better now that I'm with you.
I feel like this might be exactly the same conversation we had the last time we did this.
Probably.
We are here to talk about a great big idea, a great series. It's called A Questionable Life. It actually kicks off our 2015.
Yeah.
Which is, just a great time in terms of, people sort of making their way back to church. You know, they've kind of had that Christmas shot of adrenaline, and now they're thinking in terms of like New Year's resolutions and, okay, I'm going to really try to make my life better. I'm going to try to do some things different. And in a lot of cases, church ends up being one of the things that they kind of try on during this time. So I'm really excited about this series and what that will mean for people who are in the process of kind of making some of those changes, because I think it's got the potential to be just a really profound, cool series to hold on to. And it's got Jesus all over it, so you can't really go wrong with that. But tell us, Brian, just a little bit about A Questionable Life. What is this series? What are the goals of this series? And, what do you see as, the steps that this series takes?
Yeah. So the whole idea of this series was sort of birthed at Exponential East, I think, this past year. Mm-hmm. Michael Frost gave a talk that is referenced in here that I would say is mandatory, right, for everybody to watch, because it's so good. They're so good. So good. Never been better.
When you're watching it, you've never been better.
Yeah. So, but it really is such a good talk that not only should we watch it to prepare for this series, but it actually sort of inspired the series. Because what he says in there is that, one of our primary roles as Christ followers is to live our life in such a way that it causes people to ask questions. Mm-hmm. And we all know of our need to share Christ's hope with other people.
Right.
But a lot of us, unfortunately, we don't. We either don't know a lot of people who are far from God, like we've operated in a Christian bubble for so long, mm-hmm. Where we just go to small group, go to church. We may go to work, but we don't really work, like hang with the people at work. So we don't really just know anybody. But then the other thing is, we don't live our life in such a way that those people are interested or see anything different about us than their own life. It's like, okay, so that might be, so on Sundays you sing some songs and go to church, but other than that, there's no difference. And so right. I think the goal for this series is live your life in such a way that it will cause people to ask those questions. And then, of course, when you are sort of answering those questions, it's like the whole bless strategy that we use. You get to that part where you share your story. And since you just referenced this, I think it'll be really good if you got newcomers coming, like people who are there like, all right, I got to get my life together. I'm going to go give church a shot because it's the New Year's resolution. This is an awesome series for them because they get to see Jesus, the person we follow, doing things that like they didn't think a Jesus or a Christian would do.
Right.
And that's really cool. But then it also, I think, inspires other people like you and me who like look at, okay, it's the new year. I want to live my life in a new way to do what Jesus did. Mm-hmm. So I think it'd be cool either way.
I love it. I want to live a life that that is questioned in the right way. So we're going to start week one, and it's kind of like when Night Ranger put out their album, and the album was called Night Ranger, mm-hmm. and then they had a song called Night Ranger. Yeah. So this is like that. This is week one of the series A Questionable Life,
and it's called
A Questionable Life. Yeah. So in what specific ways are we hitting this topic for week one?
Yeah. Well, week one, we're we say that we're looking at the questions that people asked of Jesus, and we are. Week 1 is kind of a setup of all those questions, kind of riffing off those, but digging into what Paul wrote in Colossians, where he says, pray for us that God may open a door for our message. That's part of it, right? That we want to have opportunities. The other side of that is, are you living your life in a way that's creating those opportunities? So you get down to the next part. Be wise in the way you talk toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, right? Like you're adding to the conversation. You're not just like a stick on the mud. You're not just a wallflower. You are part of the dynamic of the relationship. And I'll to dive into the Michael Frost talk. Like what he talks about is very specifically like when you take a look at the life of Jesus, he lived his life in such a way that both Pharisees and pagans or those that people would have rejected, in Judaism, were both going, who is this guy? Right. Like the Pharisees were going, no, you can't eat with prostitutes or you can't eat with tax collectors. And the prostitutes and the tax collectors were like, well, you're not supposed to be paying attention to me. Why are you doing this? And so the emphasis of the first week is just that. Looking at your life and asking yourself, am I living my life in a way that anybody's questioning me? If I don't have any, it's almost like if Christians aren't sort of concerned with how I'm living my life, but right. Also on the other side of that, if like non-Christians, people who are far from God, aren't asking questions either, right. We know that we're like stuck in this mundane middle of existence where we might say we're a Christ follower, but we're not.
Yeah, and a lot of times we err on one side or the other. We want so badly to be someone who's noted for being different that we end up like being so in the Christian bubble that we're actually unapproachable by those who might note that difference, but the way that they note it is like from way over there.
Right.
As opposed to what it means, and we talked about this, to be on mission, to bless those around us that we come into contact with, and that is an operating system that is much different than sort of they will know we are Christians by our, Christian schools and Christian everything.
Yeah.
And on the other side of it, you can lose sight of the mission if you are so in tune with your neighbors that they can't tell that there's something different about you.
Right.
So I think it has the potential to be. I mean, if anything, the most challenging part of this week will be, how do you kind of create room for people to sort of insert their story, into this, so that they can kind of hear where they're at within it. Any other things about week 1 as you're thinking about bless and just sort of how these things are coming across and being put together?
No, I think you hit it really well there. We want to live in the middle of those two things you just described. We can't be in our bubble, but we also can't be so enmeshed that the people that we're hanging with don't even notice. Because the noticeable differences Christians have unfortunately focused on are schools or curse words or T-shirts or regular church attendance.
Yes.
And what we're talking about is more subtle, but more foundational as well.
Yeah. Well, and as we'll see, the differences are ones that were true of Jesus.
Right.
And the other things that you mentioned may or may not have been true of Jesus.
Right.
I don't know what school he went to.
School of Hard Knocks, I heard.
That's what they call it, the carpentry school?
Yeah, School of Hard Knocks.
School of Hard Knocks. It's not quite a hammer, but it's close. All right, well, let's move on to week 2 then, and now we're getting into some of the nitty-gritty with the stuff that really, the storylines come right out of the experience that we know from the Gospels. So let's talk a little bit about a questionable forgiveness for session 2.
Yeah, so this is story some of us are familiar with in Matthew 18, where Peter, who's one of Jesus' followers, disciples, says, how many times should I forgive someone?
Right. None.
None. Don't do it.
That's a bad idea.
Yep. And then, of course, Jesus launches into this story after saying, you know, not 7 times, Peter, but 77 times. And then he launches into this story about someone who had been forgiven, but then wouldn't forgive other people.
Right.
And so I think here, and again, just 5 seconds ago, we were talking about the subtle but more foundational ways, you know, we're to be different and to live questionable lives is for, you know, and of course you got to be interacting with people who are far from God on a regular basis for them to be able to ever see you forgive someone, right?
Sure, yeah.
This doesn't happen
You have
on a
to have
Christian
enough.
T-shirt.
Yeah, you
or-
have to have enough proximity. It's not a proclamation experience. It's a relational.
Right. It's a
experience.
relational experience, and then they're gonna, over time, you've hung out with them, they've hung out with you, you've gone over there, and you know they were having margarita night, and you joined them for margarita night, as one of Michael Frost's stories is.
Right.
But you're in their life, they're in your life so often, but then something happens where like you forgive someone, and they're like, "What the f did you just do?" Right? Like that's not how you operate. Why did you do that?
Right.
But that only happens in relationship.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
what week 2 is all about. And asking questions. Do we forgive people in such a way that is gracious, right? Or are we holding things against people? You know, are we living like unforgiven people?
Right.
Or are we living in light of the forgiveness Christ has given us?
Yeah, it's that story, that parable, I guess, or I guess not a parable, but the story that he tells is hits a little bit too close to home in some ways. You know, when you think about, and I know, like for me, it's like the times that you get the most that I get the most upset at others, I can almost like a trigger, I can remember the thing that I did to someone else that was just as bad or just as, you know, or in that same category. And I think, you know, this introspection, you know, what it means to truly forgive people, but then also to be able to do so in the context that someone could actually see it, you know, could actually see it take place. So then, you know, each one of these weeks we've got sort of the question that's asked of Jesus, and then the question asked of us, which I love. But you know, tell us just a little bit about the takeaway. What we hope to to grab from this series. You know, as people are walking out the door, what are they taking away with them?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, as you look at like the story that Jesus tells of I think it's unmerciful servant is what it's called. Like he forgot how much he had been forgiven.
Yeah.
Right. And so he felt like somebody else owes me. And so the takeaway is to be reminded of how much we've been forgiven by Jesus, which then empowers us to forgive others. Like, okay, all right, so you doing that to me isn't that big of a deal.
Right.
So I'm going to forgive you. And just in the way we didn't deserve Christ's forgiveness, right?
Yes.
We are to offer that same sort of forgiveness to other people. They don't deserve it.
Right.
They don't deserve the forgiveness, and we're giving it to them, and that's what makes everybody go, huh? You know, like, super quickly, this story of, we might all remember this, of the Amish school. You remember that school shooting many years ago in Pennsylvania? Immediately, the Amish leaders called up the parents of this guy who went into the schoolhouse and shot them and said, we just want to let you know, we hold nothing against you. We hold nothing against your son. We forgive him. They invited them to the funeral of their children. They attended the funeral of the shooter. Oh, wow. And then like 10 years later, because this happened, I think maybe 12 years ago or so, 10 years later, there were write-ups on how that forgiveness changed the parents of the son who shot everyone. They now go into the Amish village once a week and tutor the Amish.
Wow.
I mean, it's just like the ripple effect,
Yeah.
right? You know, and sometimes we don't see the after story. And so I think that's a really cool example of like how just insane forgiveness changes people.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's awesome. All right, I'm a fan. That's session 2. Session 3. This is going to be fun. I I can't think of a time that we've ever talked about this at church, in my recollection. A questionable anger. When it's rockin' awesome to be angry.
Oh, man. Righteous anger.
Righteous anger. Yes.
Yeah, so this is the story of Jesus walking in and flipping over the tables in the temple because the religious leaders had turned the house of prayer into a house of robbers, into a marketplace. The worst part...
Kind of into like a family Christian store.
Into a Berean Christian store. Lifeway.
I can't tell you how tempting it always is for me anytime I happen to be in one of those stores to reenact this scene.
Flip tables over.
Yeah, just to see what people would do. Not necessarily because I'm enraged, although testaments are a mess. There's no doubt about it.
They are a mess.
But I just kind of want to see what people would do.
If you flipped over tables?
Yeah.
I think, though, this is the week we're starting to promote John and Dave's new book and selling it in the back of the...
I hope so. I hope so.
That would be so good.
You could just head to the back. The tables are right out there.
Right outside.
Please don't turn them over.
Donation of any size, at least $15. So Jesus walks in and he flips over the tables, and one of the, we'll discover this. There's no need to go into it here, but like as we write these messages, one of the reasons Jesus was so angry is not just that they turned it into a marketplace, but they were stealing from the poor. Like the poor weren't bringing their animals with them to sacrifice because they traveled such a long distance. They had to buy them there. Right. And so they were selling them, things, I will get this wrong, but it's almost, if I remember correctly, like 75 times the price that they would normally pay because they had to buy them. And they're selling them in the temple. So this is about justice.
Right.
Like Jesus wasn't just angry that they were selling trinkets. He was angry because there was a sacrificial system the Jews had to go through in order to be purified, and so the Jews were capitalizing on that by basically stealing from the poor to get it done. And Jesus said, no, like that's not happening in my house, kind of thing. That's what I think is going to be so cool about this message.
Yeah. So then, how does that apply to us? So what was the question asked of Jesus? What's the question then that's asked of us?
So the question asked of us is, are we angry about the same things that angered Jesus?
That's a burn. That is such a burn.
Burn. And if we were to take this to like the level we took like the first message, like so often Christians get upset about things that wouldn't really upset Jesus, right? We choose our battles very poorly as Christ followers sometimes. But then the things that would really upset Jesus, we seem to not have a problem with.
Right.
Or we don't respond in the way that Jesus would respond. Painted all throughout the scriptures is that, God defends the poor, the fatherless, the widows, the oppressed. And then a lot of times we spend our energy like getting upset and using Jesus' name to get upset about things that don't really concern him. Whereas this message is going to be like, listen, are you going to get like upset and leverage your power, influence, energy over the same things that Jesus would get upset about?
Right.
Not to be ridiculous, but what tables are you going to turn over after like sort of getting to know who Jesus is and what he really cares about? So
Yeah. What action are you? What injustice is out there that you just sort of let slip by?
Right.
You've not been impacted by. And I mean, again, to get to the point where you're talking about a questionable life, when you speak up for those things, when you make those moves, when you turn those tables, who is responding to that? And what kind of a difference does your stepping into that, and you becoming a person of questionable anger in that way?
Right.
How does that speak to a world that desperately needs Jesus?
Yep.
That's good stuff. Martin Luther King. Can't do this topic without a little Martin Luther King.
You can't talk about justice and injustice without MLK.
Yeah. A time comes when silence is betrayal. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
All right. Let's move on to session 4 then, because I don't really want to talk about that one anymore. I thought it was going one way, and then but we're not gonna take out the family Christian stores. So
We're
it's a different thing. It's a different thing. That's okay. I'll have my time. Just for the music is worth turning the tables over sometimes.
just for the music.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh boy. Week 4, session 4. It's questionable relationships. What? We need to foster questionable relationships. So what are we talking about here with the people around us?
So the story we're looking at in the life of Jesus is when he, hangs out with Matthew, the tax collector, asks him to follow him. The Pharisees
Let's
come
go
back.
eat at your house.
He says, they say, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? He replies, not the healthy need a doctor, but the sick. He goes on in one of the most incredible passages in all of Scripture. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. We talk about that all day, right? What is Jesus really asking of us? Well, he's asking us to be kind and compassionate and love the people that no one else pays attention to. Sometimes, because we'll talk about this the week prior, the injustices often happen to the poor and the marginalized, the oppressed, etc. And of course, we want to build healthy relationships with them. But I think in this case, we are talking about who are the people that almost we're trained culturally as Christians to avoid, and who might we build relationships with that Christians would say, why are you hanging out with that person? And that person might say, dude, why are you hanging out with me? You are with this talk and with next week's talk that we'll get to in a second, so much of this has to be something that's driven from within, your heart. This is not about some behavioral thing, because you just said a few moments ago, we could go hang out with people who are engaged in all kinds of things that we wouldn't ever engage in, and then if our heart isn't aligned with Jesus, we could very easily just become like them.
Sure.
Like that.
Right.
But a heart aligned with Jesus, you can go hang out with people who engage in strange things that you and I would never engage in, but you are a light in that dark place. You haven't just turned out your light to go hang out with them. You're a light in that dark place, and over time, they are going to see a difference in you. But your Christian friends or your, parents or, people at the church or whatever might not fully understand it.
Yeah. No, that's good. And I think we talked about the blessed practices in week 1, but it certainly feels like with this one they're going to need to sort of show up again, because it's what's the how-to manual on that? It's I may want to do that, but how do I do it? And you can't beat that formula, I don't think, of beginning with prayer and listening to what their needs are and hanging out and eating, finding opportunities to serve, and then finally sort of getting that credibility to be able to share your story. That's how you make a difference relationally with people who are it's really interesting. We had a neighborhood friend who, and without getting into too much of the sort of personal details, but this was a friend who was moving away, and the husband was very much against religion of any kind, but his wife went through a very, very serious traumatic experience, and turned to her friends who were Christians, and ministered to them, loved them for who they were, blessed them, and it was interesting because this husband who was leaving, he was making a speech to a gathering of several of us, several neighbors, and I work at a church or whatever. It's we've had spiritual conversations, but when he talked about the people who sort of got them through that difficult situation with his wife, he talked about that person, that friend who blessed him, blessed their family, wasn't trying to save him.
Right.
Was allowing him to be who he was, a person who was irreligious,
right,
and didn't want to hear it, but he was still affected by it and moved by it to the point where in this moment, as they're getting ready to leave and leave the country, move away, he specifically calls her out by name as a thanks for that moment. And I remember sharing with her after that, I said, it's like you might feel like it's not successful because he didn't cross that particular line in this particular moment.
Right.
But everything that you were doing was living that questionable relational life to the point where he actually called you out on it in a very positive way.
Yep.
So, I mean, when you see it working, it's really, really powerful. It's and it's and it's worth having people say, "You really hang out with those people?"
Yeah. But none of it happens. I mean, you just described it perfectly. None of it happens outside the context of relationships.
Yeah.
You don't accomplish anything by like wearing something or even saying something or refraining from something if it's not in the context of relationships. If this person decided, well, they're not religious and I don't want to be influenced by their irreligion, well, then there would never have been that moment ever.
Right.
And she didn't have to hide her relationship with Jesus.
Right.
But what she chose to do was not judge this guy for where he was in his life.
Right.
And that's what we're getting at right there. That's why this message and the one we'll talk about next, it's about what's going on inside your heart. Because if it's behavioral based, then we lose.
Yeah. So. Because and I think it's like I like that you're saying that, because I think that we could get lost in the mechanism of it. It's like, oh, okay, so to be like Jesus, I need to like put on this Jesus shell, which means I go and hang out with people at the bar or whatever. Well, that's not the first step. The first step is inside.
Right.
No, I like that. That's awesome. All right. Well, we're almost there. We've almost fixed it all.
Almost to the finish
right?
line.
Yeah. Session
so
5.
good.
It's so good. Session 5 is questionable behavior. So after all this, we're still going to talk about behavior, huh? Man. We just talked about this last night in my small group. Talked about values.
Why didn't we record that?
Narrative and behavior. I don't know. It was a good one. I should have recorded it.
Was Brian Zare there?
No, he wasn't. But
he wrote that.
I know, but it was the big idea.
Yeah.
So we talked about it. Everyone was very convicted by it. It was really good.
That's
good.
good.
It was very cool. But we're going to question it. We're going to question that behavior.
We're going to question it. This is a tricky one.
Oh, great.
And I set it up in the last week, but this is tricky because there's the great potential to just make this about the shell, But what Jesus does, and if we stay online with what we're reading here in Scripture, and if we are interpreting it all correctly, like the Pharisees come and say, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat." You would be ceremonially unclean unless you wash your hands up to your wrist, before you eat. Oh, the disciples aren't doing it, which maybe is kind of grody anyway, because come on, washing your hands.
Right. Whether or not it's ceremonially an issue.
Right.
It might just be
Come on, Jesus. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're passing germs here, So Jesus replies with a question, as he normally does. Why do you break the command of God for the sake of your tradition? So you've got a tradition of washing hands that you're unwilling to relent on, but you'll break the command of God. And then he goes into the command of God that they break about honoring their mother and father, which I just think is awesome. He's saying here, okay, you're willing to do the outer shell stuff, but you're not willing to do the work internally, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't do the work internally, none of the external stuff matters. And so it would be easy for us in this message to talk external stuff.
Sure.
To
behavior,
say, is your behavior different than everybody else's? Are they noticing that you pray before meals? Are they noticing, or whatever it would be? And you're like, really? Whatever. But are they noticing almost and it's not are they noticing, it's what is your why behind your doing things? Mm-hmm. And if you're in relationship with people long enough, it will eventually happen. Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
it will eventually, get there. And so the question we say asked of us is, are we breaking or keeping traditions and cultural norms in a way that reveals a heart for Jesus? Or are we living in such a way that reveals our heart, or that our hearts are that of a modern day Pharisee? Because you can keep the rules, right?
Sure, yeah.
But be Pharisaical. I mean, that's what
You can have
Jesus,
all the right behavior, but not the right heart.
right?
You can have the right heart, but you're not living it out in ways that people can see.
I think if you develop the right heart, the behavior will follow.
Yeah.
Right?
Uh-huh.
But just doing the behavior, that's not it.
Yeah.
Because that's what Jesus was saying. You guys got the behavior down, but you don't, because your hearts are rotten.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I like this. He says, what goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of their mouth, that's what defiles them. That's something to chew on. See what I did there?
that was good. That was good.
So this takeaway feels more difficult to me because I think, like you said, it's a little bit loaded. It's a little bit hard to figure out, okay, well, what am I supposed to walk out of here doing? How am I supposed to think about my behavior? And in some ways we might fall into the trap of kind of the Israelites of like, how do I make sure I'm getting it right? Because if I just get it right, I may not be getting it right.
Yeah. You want me to answer?
Yeah,
that, or,
I do. I want to hear this answer, and I want it to be the right answer.
Well, I think it's like, when I think about some of the cultural norms in the church, am I engaged in them because of my relationship with Jesus driving me to do them? Or do I think that by doing them, I'm going to somehow please Jesus? Right? But then when we think about cultural norms, like in the world, like, when I engage in them, am I engaging in them in such a way that reveals my love for Jesus through them? Or am I engaging in them or keeping from them? Like, so I'm not going to do certain things. Like, I'm not going to go to the bar, or I'm not going to do this. But the only reason I'm doing it is because somehow I think I'm achieving accolades by God by doing that. And I think you can break the rules for the wrong reasons, and you can keep the rules for the wrong reasons. Okay,
that's
so
good, yeah.
like this again, it goes back to what's motivating you to do what it is you're doing. That's what Jesus is talking to the Pharisees about. It's not what enters the mouth, it's what comes out of it, because everything you do flows from the heart, right? I mean, we read that in Proverbs.
Yeah.
Everything you do comes out of the heart, so guard your heart. So that's what this message is really about. So when we wrote it, or when we had the Big Idea Map meeting, we were going to call it a questionable heart, and they were like, questionable behavior, I think, makes you think, wait, they're going to talk about behavior. This sucks. But we're not really going to talk about behavior. We're going to talk about your heart.
Right, right. So it's a little bit of a shell game. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's a shell game.
Like it's like a Ponzi scheme, like it's a pyramid. So
Yes. Yep. Bernie Madoff is going to be our key contributor to the message.
Well, I mean, it is. I mean, I will say it's probably the more difficult of the five, but it's probably the best way to end the series because when it's a matter of the heart, the things that have preceded it really do flow out of that.
Yeah, got to get back to the heart of the matter.
Yeah, I'm finding that. Yeah, it's tough though. The will gets weak. That's what happens. So it's tough, but I'm thinking it's about forgiveness, and that was week 2.
Even
if you don't love me anymore, and I know that's not true. Well, this has been a great opportunity to go over this topic and figure out where we're headed. Remember, utilize this time to allow yourself to be inspired. Be thinking in terms of, in your environment when you're talking about music or you're talking about video or storytelling, testimony pieces. I think a series like this is going to have lots and lots of opportunities for many different expressions from the weekend service perspective. And then, of course, as you're thinking about small group curriculum, where this is headed, and how small groups, as they sort of kick off that new year, what it looks like for your small groups to be thinking in terms of, how do we challenge each other? How do we hold each other accountable to some of these things? Because they're not easy to get through.
Right.
But it, it could very well be, just some very exciting times for small groups as they are challenged with this, and then, essentially commissioned to experience that over the course of the brand new year. So very excited. Thanks so much for spending some time with us. As always, I'm Eric Bramlett. This has been Brian Moll. Thanks so much for joining the Big Idea Podcast, and we'll see you later. So long, everybody.